Bleh. Ed Wood, directed by Tim Burton. Okay, so Sleepy Hollow International Film Festival happened at the Tarrytown Music Hall, and the film that they were showing for its 30th anniversary was Ed Wood, which came out in 1994. This, I can't say that this is Tim Burton's. I don't know if this is Tim Burton's. I don't know if this is my favorite Tim Burton movie. No, sorry. Let me dial that back. I can't say for certain that this is Tim Burton's best movie, although I want to say that it might be in the number one slot, but you could argue maybe Edward Scissorhands or Beetlejuice. Tim Burton's made a lot of really great movies, but it's by far my favorite Tim Burton movie. It's a masterpiece. He didn't win, but the movie won Academy Awards. Martin Landau won for portraying Bela Lugosi. And I believe the makeup that turned him into Bela Lugosi also won, which was done by Rick Baker, if I'm not mistaken. The movie is also, once again, another black and white movie. And, it's a biopic, but it's not like a straight biopic. It's a biopic that takes artistic liberties in the most wonderful way. In fact, for me, Ed Wood is the gold standard of what a biopic should be. I think biopics, they don't have to be pound for pound the truth. And maybe there needs to be a disclaimer beforehand that says artistic liberties have been taken here or there, or maybe not. Maybe it's more like a Stephen King sort of thing of or whoever said that originally, when confronted with the truth and the legend, always print the legend. And so, Tim Burton, with the help, I want to credit the screenwriters because they really deserve to be notated here. Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski, who wrote this movie, they just knocked it out of the park, man. They say it right here in the synopsis. When it came to making bad movies, Ed Wood was the best. I mean, is that not the most perfect sort of surmisation of who and what Ed Wood was? The mostly true. So they say it's the mostly true story of the legendary worst director of all time, who, with the help of his strange friends, filmed countless B movies without ever becoming famous or successful. And what's interesting is, and again, why I say mostly true, Tim Burton, when Tim Burton is at his best, I think is when he's doing completely original things, when you think about Edward Scissorhands, and obviously Edward Scissorhands is borrowing from other places. It's Frankenstein and Pinocchio. There's a lot going into Edward Scissorhands. And the same can be said for Beetlejuice, or maybe it can't, because Beetlejuice as a concept it's a ghost story. It's an exorcist story. And every one of these stories is always the misfit fish out of water. Everybody else is normal. And what we're doing, we're outliers who are weirdos, freaks, and misfits who are just, doing our own thing. And typically we're misunderstood, but we're not evil, but we're treated like monsters. And that's true for Edward Scissorhands. That's true for Beetlejuice, for Alec Baldwin, Gina Davis, the ghosts. And that's true for Ed Wood and his motley band of filmmaking fiends, but it's the idea that for Ed Wood, which I guess maybe you could kind of really call a fictional story based on a real person, and it's such an original film. I can't think, there are very few. I mean, you have Living in Oblivion. You have Bullfinger and Living in Oblivion. And I believe both of those came after Ed Wood. I'm trying to think of another film pre-1994, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that where you have somebody, a movie about a guy trying to make movies. I don't think that that's out there. And obviously the big one is American Movie, that documentary, which came out. Ed Wood, despite being a biopic, is so ingeniously original in what it's doing. It's like a Halloween movie that has nothing to do, that has no horror in it, except for the horror of being an artist and wanting to be accepted for making art. And in this case, there's so much going on between Ed Wood. Ed Wood was a transvestite, or a cross-dresser. I don't know how you want to categorize him or how he wanted to categorize himself. And, in a way, and this is really crazy too, Ed Wood was the first punk rock filmmaker. He predates Herschel Gordon Lewis and John Waters and all the rest. He's, in the 50s, he was the outlier trying to make art. And the way that Johnny Depp, God, I could talk about this movie for hours and I can't. But the way Johnny Depp portrays Ed Wood as this like sunny optimist who just all he wants to do is just live out his dream. And along the way, he finds a chosen family of filmmaking brethren. It's beautiful. And obviously this movie is also a reflection of Tim Burton's real life relationship with Vincent Price, also gets injected into the story in the way that Ed Wood was enamored with Bela Lugosi and worked with Bela Lugosi at the end of his life. Everybody else saw Bela Lugosi as this washed up trash. And that's kind of interesting that he makes trash movies, quote unquote, even though he didn't think what he was making as trash. But here he is making trash, and he's taking what people perceive as trash. Obviously, Bela Lugosi was never trash, but he's taking what people perceive as trash and he's making trash movies with it. So Ed Wood is the original punk rocker, man. He is, even, if you want to like pull the term punk rocker outside of music and like just the attitude of like being an artist, being like a punk rocker, I would say Ed Wood predates them all, man. He really does. He really fucking does. He was the underground before there was an underground. He was the counterculture before there was a counterculture. And you could say maybe like, Roger Corman was just a few steps later, right, in the late 50s, but Ed Wood, man, Ed Wood was the first one. And he's heralded today as like a patron saint of trash and bad taste and all these things. He opened the door that we all walk through, And so to see Tim Burton have the sensibility to sort of to recognize the brilliance of the material and do something with it in his own way. And Tim Burton really is, he's an auteur, man. I used to be like really hard on Tim Burton for like some of the story stuff, because I would say there are certain story things that are really weak with Tim Burton. You look at like, or he's also committed some atrocities like Planet of the Apes is Planet of the Apes is something else, man. And not too many people dig those Alice in Wonderland or the Dark Shadows or the his track record starts to get a little patchy, but Tim Burton in the 80s into the 90s Tim Burton, uncorruptible, like untouchable, just firing on all cylinders, just pure artistic genius in every sense of the word. And it was before he really got into, it's before he got really into CGI, but he was doing things that needed CGI before CGI was really practical, which led to a lot of really interesting creative movie making. Like, for instance, you may not realize this, but in Batman, like the original Batman, there's a shot that there's the first shot of Batman is actually animated. There's an animated shot of Batman looking down below the city and then turning around and walking away. That cape is animated, dude. It just, God, he just blows my mind with how awesome it is. The claymation, Large Marge sent you, and he's uncompromising in his style, like even in Ed Wood, which is like supposed to be LA in the 1950s, he finds these little places to put his signature Tim Burton style, particularly the spook house that they go to, the thing that they're sitting in with the eye swirl, and the core of the story, the idea of him just wanting to be accepted for who he is, right? And who was Ed Wood underneath it all? I think Ed Wood was the toothless guy wearing what's it called? Angora, wearing an Angora sweater and doing a belly dance for all of his friends in a refrigerated meat house. You know what I mean? Like, that was Ed Wood. And you know what was beautiful about Ed Wood and beautiful about that, at least in the story? Ed Wood knew who he was, and he was comfortable with who he was. There was the people around him that maybe didn't accept him for who he was, but he knew who he was and he was comfortable with it. And his filmmaking friends were. And that's all that mattered. So there's a lot to be taken from this movie. Like there's so much, like and then the whole thing with Bela Lugosi, man, and like the tragic, sort of end of his life, and the idea that he could find someone like Ed Wood who just saw what nobody else saw about Bela Lugosi at that time, who was living in Boris Karloff's shadow. The script is so just perfect in the way that it insinuates, someone brings up Boris Karloff and he has this whole thing about like, how he was supposed to play Frankenstein, and, it's just showing the vulnerability and the fragility of Bela Lugosi outside of just being like an old washed up movie star who is now a morphine addict. You know what I mean? As well as the vulnerability of like wanting to get help. He wanted to get help, and Ed he said, when are we going to make another movie? And Ed recognizing like doing what he had to do for his friend by going out and shooting this crappy little footage, which would be the beginning of Plan 9 from Outer Space, right? Bela Lugosi's final film is Plan 9 from Outer Space, right outside of his house, and just like admiring some roses, because that's all he had. He had just this little bit of film, and then he builds this whole movie around it, and everybody will remember Ed Wood for Plan 9. I mean, just everything comes from Ed Wood, man. All of it. It really does. I mean, even like what the Misfits are, like the sensibilities of the Misfits, it all stems back to Plan 9. I mean, Ed Wood, Glenn Danzig literally named his new label Plan 9 after that, right? So I don't know, man. I really do. It may not be, I think it's his best movie. It's definitely my favorite. And if you've never seen Ed Wood, if you're like flirting with wanting to be a filmmaker or wanting to be an artist, you need to watch Ed Wood. It's imperative. And, on a lot of different levels. And again, the movie is not just a filmmaking movie. As I said, like it works on so many different levels. All right. I can't, I'm aimlessly just praising Ed Wood when I'm not very focused in what I need to say, but you get the gist. Ed Wood, phenomenal masterpiece, obviously 5 stars. Like can't be denied.